This is the Bruchim Podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Previously on the Bruchim Podcast.
But I'm just flagging, mere bodily integrity for me doesn't impress me for the reasons and for the type of examples, crazy as they may sound, that I'm raising. But you know, if there's a harm or a loss, that's a different story. Or if there's a disrespect, different story.
I actually do tend to side with Jeff on that specific point. I'm also not super swayed by bodily integrity, although I appreciate, Eli, why you raise it and stand by it. And that, in part, Jeff, is why I'm really interested in the other sorts of reasons I mentioned.
Welcome back to the Bruchim Podcast. I'm your host, Eli Unger-Sargon, and joining me today from New Haven, Connecticut is our Director of Education, Max Duboff. Max, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Eli agreed. What a season it's been on the Bruchim Podcast. Wow.
It has. And I'll get to the sort of special nature of the episode that we're going to be recording today in a second. But I just want our listeners to know that if you hear some helicopters in the background, it's because I am in Los Angeles and the city is literally on fire. And there's nothing I can do about that. And I'm very happy that the helicopters are in the air. So just a sound note from your trusty sound engineer.
Indeed. Oy.
So this episode, what we wanted to do was sort of look back at this season that we had and do a little, metabolism, right? We had some pretty high level, interesting conversations, lots of really interesting ideas. And we thought it would be useful both for us, but also for our audience, for you, dear listener, to do a little digestion of what took place over this past season. Right, Max?
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I think there's a lot of threads here that we're going to continue exploring in many ways in the future, and that connected also to season one. And, we'll talk a lot about some of these interesting threads, but also we'd love to hear from you, our listeners, about what really stuck out to you from this season as well.
Absolutely. So where to start? I mean, there was just so many rich, interesting conversations that were had. Maybe we should start with some themes that kind of pop out from all of the conversations. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds great. So, certainly one of the most clear themes this season is hatafat brit, right? Which is something that is not discussed all that much publicly in Jewish and certainly not other spaces, right? And so a lot of what we're trying to do is really help, in the vein of what Max Buckler is doing with his recent paper, help bring up hatafat brit as a case for discussion, as something that, can really help inform a lot of our discussions of genital cutting and also issues of Jewish identity and things like that.
We did, I believe it was 4 episodes. Did we go 4 or 5 or even, if you count Bryn Solomon's, we might have more than 4.
So 4 plus, I think 4 episodes devoted entirely to hatafat brit or almost so. And then, a couple more episodes where we brought it up and discussed it a bit. So definitely a 4-episode core series, and then it suffused the rest of the season as well.
I want to start by saying something that stands out to me that I think our colleague Max Buckler gets absolutely right is that hatafat brit, it seems like a marginal practice, but actually when you think about it, what it does is it gives you a really valuable perspective on other genital cutting practices. And I think that's what he was pushing. And I think he made the case in his paper, he made the case on his episode, and I think that's beyond doubt at this point. I think we've demonstrated that, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's quite persuasive to me, right? I mean, maybe someone will find some kind of genital cutting or similar practice someday that's even less invasive than hatafat brit or causes, as in a similar way, doesn't cause a body modification or something like that. But I totally agree with Max that hatafat brit is really helpful for thinking through these kinds of issues. And in that vein, so Max's argument, right, is that if hatafat brit is wrong, then all the more so, kal v'chomer, a lot of other genital cutting practices are wrong. So, Eli, I'm curious to hear from you. So, just like kind of put simply, do you think that hatafat brit in general, what are some of the moral issues with it, do you think? I take it that a lot of the core questions are about with children or with those who can't consent. So just to really supplement Max's argument here, what can we say about its moral issues?
There's a point at which we posed this question to Claire Chambers in our episode with her near the end. And her initial reaction was my initial reaction when I first learned about hatafat brit, which is, oh, wait, are you suggesting this as an alternative to brit milah? Right? That's the initial reaction. Yeah. And the reason that's the initial reaction, I think, is because it's coming from this place where you're so, like, if you, like a Claire Chambers or like us, are so immersed in thinking about the ethics of circumcision, then the first thing that comes to mind when you learn of another Jewish practice that is less damaging is, oh, well, maybe it could sub in, right? Maybe we could swap it out. And I think it makes perfect sense to have that reaction, because if you're thinking about hatafat brit as compared to circumcision from an ethical perspective, it's just no contest.
And that's what Bryn is proposing in its teshuva, right? Yeah. So
yeah. And I mean, I think this point is really interesting to think about for a second, right? Which is that if you compare the ethics, no contest, and it doesn't matter who we're talking about. Are we talking about adults? Are we talking about children? Are we talking about minors? Like, it doesn't matter if we're measuring the ethics of hatafat brit against the ethics of full-on circumcision. Hatafat brit wins and actually comes out looking pretty rosy, no pun intended, right? Because there's no body modification involved. And it was designed, as we discussed, by the rabbis for that very purpose. So looking at them side by side, you kind of are like, wait, why can't we just move to this? And we saw other people having that reaction too. First of all, in season 1, I think Jeff was kind of reaching for something like that.
Yeah.
And the reason he gave, less harm, better, less pain, better, right? Obviously. We also had Rabbi Oren Steinitz this season talking sort of like wistfully wishing that hatafat brit could swap out the circumcision requirement for adult converts.
Yeah. Well, so I just want to be clear, though, about some of what we might take to be some of the ethical concerns about hatafat brit with children. So, and this came up in our conversation with Claire as well when we asked her about this, right? It seems like a lot of concerns about bodily integrity might apply to hatafat brit, even if there's not a body modification, right? That if there's some kind of way that genitalia is seen to be a special locus of concern, something that we want folks to have agency over, then we want to restrict ethically ways that others can handle it. This is something that came up with Max and a bit with Brian, right? So bodily integrity as a concept really plays into hatafat brit. And then, that's related to issues of things like autonomy, and there's a lot of nitpicking we could do about differences between different relevant concepts. And then there's, issues about duties of care and what's in the child's best interest that we talked about, right? And so I think a lot of what we were dancing around in some of our episodes is that, we're skeptical that duties of care or what's in the child's best interest can license genital cutting practices, or even a practice like hatafat brit that is not or is cutting in a sense, but is not a body modification.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get to that, and I think that's the next step, right? So if we're thinking about this in phases, right? Like almost like an experiential, like how do you experience learning about hatafat brit? And how does your thinking change about it? So the first layer is that Claire reaction, like, oh, you mean to swap it out as an alternative, as a harm reduction measure, or what Jeff was saying, or Rabbi Steinitz was saying. The next step is what Max Buckler brings to the table, which is, no, we do need to think about all those things. We need to think about bodily integrity. We need to think about duties of care. I'm wondering on this level, Max, because last season, if I understood you correctly, you were expressing skepticism on the arguments for bodily integrity. And I'm wondering if this season, thinking about hatafat brit has changed the way you think about those arguments.
Yeah, no, that's a really helpful question. I'm so glad you raised that, Eli. Yeah, so some of what I'm concerned about with some arguments about bodily integrity is treating the sort of whole or natural body as better by default, right? And this is something that Claire Chambers gets into in her book Intact in ways that we didn't even get to really fully explore with her. And so I take it that a common move among people who are talking about the ethics of circumcision, especially some intactivists, is to prize the body in some kind of unmodified state, maybe even an imagined unmodified state, right? And that sort of conception of bodily integrity as wholeness, as unmodifiedness, in a sense, that's what I think I was skeptical of and still am skeptical of. And, in our episode with Claire, we really tried to be clear of, that her principle of the unmodified body is not that, right? Is not about simply saying that the unmodified body is better or something like that, but rather a political principle to resist pressures to modify. And so if bodily integrity is understood as some kind of limits around interfering with others' bodies and some kind of special concern for how we treat others' bodies, this is kind of nebulous and it's hard to really fully capture. But that's a principle of bodily integrity that I really do want to fully endorse.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Thank you for making it, because I felt very lonely last season when there we were face to face with a moral giant of our time, Jeff Helmreich. And you two were ganging up on me around bodily integrity. But what you just articulated is actually the concept of bodily integrity that I endorse too. And I think one of the things that Claire does brilliantly is, in addition to sort of resisting the kind of wholeness discourse, she also really digs into this concept of natural. Like, what is it? Yeah. What is the natural body, and how that's actually a slippery concept in many ways, right?
Yeah. No, and I'm really interested, and we can't go into this fully now. I'm really interested in feminist critiques of naturalness and concern about, sort of constructions of naturalness. There's a lot to say about this, and Claire does go into some of this in her book Intact. And so, I think it's important to recognize that there are some kinds of things that can be considered natural, but that doesn't mean that they're not also, in a sense, constructed, right? And this came up a little bit in some of our discussion with Elizabeth Reese, and as a historian of intersex, she's really dealt with some of these issues as well, especially in her book Bodies in Doubt, about medical responses to intersex.
So we have our hatafat brit might be something that would be less harmful than circumcision. Wouldn't it be a good idea to swap out hatafat brit with circumcision? Then we have our Max Buckler sort of moment where it's like, oh, no, actually there are these other things like bodily integrity and duties of care that come into play with hatafat brit as well, especially when it's done on a minor. And I think one of the most striking moments in the entire season was the interview that we did with our anonymous family from the Midwest.
For sure.
Where we learned that not only is this a sort of theoretical concern of, duties of care and bodily integrity and these sorts of things, but we learned of an actual individual who had a hatafat brit done to them against their will, and how that ended up destroying both their Jewish identity and their relationship with their family, right?
Yeah, and I just want to take a moment to sincerely thank all the folks who shared about their personal experiences with us, both the anonymous family, as well as Jason, Yoshi, and Tim. And so, it's a really awful situation. And one thing that I think it's really important to note, and that I'm so glad we were able to bring up in this season, is that, kind of how we interact with folks who are minors from a legal perspective is so charged, not only morally, but also religiously, right? That there's so much that we need to do in thinking about how do we relate to children in our sorts of Jewish communities, right? And, there was maybe some hint that things are getting a little bit better in some ways in terms of the story we heard from the anonymous family about maybe rabbis not being so callous about something like hatafat brit for a child who doesn't want it. But still, there aren't really any kinds of safeguards. And it's easy to imagine someone being pressured into this and finding it to be a real violation, and that having a really negative impact.
Yeah, and I think we also sort of uncovered what for me was new, which is that there's something morally worse about doing it to a child at an age when they have the ability to say no. That even if we're going to take seriously concerns about bodily integrity and duties of care when we're talking about an infant, that there's something like there's a new level of moral violation when it's done to someone who has the ability to and is actually saying no to the procedure, right?
Yeah. And, I think this is a fascinating issue in medical ethics in general, right? That how do you sort of take into account the ways that folks will relate to what has happened to their own bodies as we consider various kinds of body modifications, not only to choose for them, but to sort of include them in decision-making processes.
Yeah. And Claire Chambers made the point when she was explaining her concept of bodily integrity in a very sort of direct and I thought beautiful way, which was like, so, okay, fine. So we talk about this sort of principle of bodily integrity, but why is it actually such an important thing, right? Why is it so important? And what she says very clearly and directly, and I think this is absolutely true, and it amplifies this point that we heard from our anonymous family, is that when violations of this kind are done against a person's will, there are some of the worst kinds of ethical violations that we know of.
Yeah, no, that's true as well, right? We can imagine different sorts of attitudes that someone might have to something, right? And maybe if someone doesn't have a preference and you do something to them that could be ethically different than if you're really going against their will. But in any case, there's serious ethical problems here, and it's really important to take account of those. And in an interview in the Evolve podcast, which I know I've thought about a lot, Rabbi Kevin Bernstein, a Moyle, mentioned that he really hesitates to perform hatafat brit for anyone kind of from the age of 4-ish up who's still a kid, right? And so, I really wonder how common this sort of attitude is among mohalim and rabbis who are interacting with folks who might undergo hatafat brit, but I hope very common. I hope that, a lot of folks are exercising this sort of care. And I think it's consistent with being very supportive of circumcision and hatafat brit to exercise this sort of care about really making sure that you're not crossing ethical boundaries when it comes to any kind of genital touching or cutting with children.
But we also, Max, got some stories of people who had very positive feelings about their hatafot brit, and I thought I
really appreciate that too.
Yeah, that contrast was interesting. Like understanding the kind of religious significance that this played in the lives of all of the people that we interviewed were converts, right?
Yeah, and Matt talking about his circumcision as well, and that was a fascinating conversation. And thank you to Matt for chatting with you about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But this all kind of comes back to this idea that we sort of hinted at, I think, in the first season, but is really becoming very clear, I think, at this point, which is it's not just that, there are ethical violations that go along with circumcising infants and minors or doing hatafat brit on an infant or a minor. It's also that on a certain level, the person to whom it's being done isn't getting what they could be getting out of it, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe the moment of this season that I keep coming back to most is when Rabbi Oren said that he's skeptical about any kind of conversion for kids, not just hatafat brit, right? But like, what does it mean for there to be a conversion of a child or something like that? Like, how can this really have the sort of significance that conversion is supposed to have when someone, isn't able to make that decision fully to join the Jewish people, right? And so, I'm not necessarily recommending any specific changes in practice or saying that, maybe birthright religious status shouldn't be a thing either. These are really complicated issues. But I think there's a very deep point here about, when we're talking about these sorts of practices that are supposed to have a covenantal element, we need to not ignore the covenantal element and everything that's associated with it.
Yeah, for me, the person who really knocked this one home for me was Matthew Barron Jones, my friend Matt, and he really just sort of was and it's like it's almost like a scripted case, right? His father left him intact on purpose because he valued the foreskin. Yeah. And Matt converted to Judaism and describes his circumcision as the most significant spiritual experience of his life. I mean, you couldn't script it better.
No, it's very good. No, but and indeed, and that's really heartening. There's something that's incredible about that, and there's a lot of things that this case underscores. One is the importance of consent, the importance of being able to take something on for oneself, but also, and I think this comes out in the cases of some of the folks we talked to about their hatafat brit as well, the importance of these sorts of genital cutting practices as part of the process of either converting or of reaffirming one's Judaism in a sort of Gior L'chumra situation. These practices make sense in this context, right? And, and I think both of us really appreciated our conversation with Naama Karlin in season 1, where there was this sort of idea from Derrida that circumcision is a marking, even if someone doesn't appreciate it for themselves. I think that a lot of where I kept coming back to, both in that episode and beyond, was, no, this only is a marking in a Jewish sort of way if someone appreciates it as such. And so how can we help it be appreciated as such? And sort of when we're thinking about both its ethicality and its religiosity, how can we take account of, treating it as such? Yeah.
And then Bryn Solomon comes in and complicates everything.
Yeah, and oh gosh, what a fascinating teshuva. And we didn't even get into a lot of the complexities and the detailed arguments. So, one thing that I will say is that how to think about the role of halakha in contemporary Jewish life is really complicated. I mean, this came out in season 1 in our series on ethics and halakha. And, I think that one thing that's really encouraging and will create a lot of challenges, but also opportunities, is that throughout a lot of the liberal Jewish world, attitudes towards halakha and how to relate to traditional sources are changing and growing. And so, I think that having folks who are thinking about a lot of the kinds of sources that might be relevant for anatomy and for body-based mitzvot and for, differences between different kinds of genital and other covenantal practices is going to be so, so important. And I mean, we're obviously committed to education, but, I hope that we get more discussion about a lot of these topics.
Yeah, I wonder, when I think about Bryn's excellent tshuva, and I think we did it justice in our episode, what I'd like to highlight for a second, for the sake of our progression, right, from, maybe hatafat brit could be a substitution for circumcision, to, there are problems with hatafat brit when it comes to minors and children, to starting to think more broadly, and then Bryn problematizing it in a very particular way. But the force of Bryn's tshuva, to me, a lot of it comes from the suggestion, not that hatafat brit over the heart become an option. The tshuva argues that it should become the way everyone does it. And that's really interesting. What do you think about that, Max?
Yeah, so no, this is a great question, right? So one way of relating to this question is via a debate in feminism about gender abolitionism, right? So one possible view that you can take is that the cause of equality requires that gender as it currently exists be dismantled or pushed so far to the margins that it doesn't matter. And one way of understanding how to move forward is to try to make it the case that although gender continues to exist in some kind of form recognizably similar to the way it does today, it doesn't create a lot of the problems that it does today. Now, these possibilities are both far in the future. There's a lot that we can do now that sort of both these camps can agree on. And I think that we can maybe think about analogous positions when it comes to circumcision or other kinds of genital cutting practices, right? So if we're uncomfortable with circumcision as it exists today and think that it's morally wrong in some way, do we work towards a world where there's some kind of other option, other practice that is the norm and that is coercive in a way? Or do we work towards some kind of world where circumcision and things like it are mainly based on choice or something like that? I think it's a really hard question. I lean toward thinking that for circumcision specifically, I'm uncomfortable with any practice recognizably similar being coercive, especially any cutting practice. But I'm very sympathetic to the idea of having some kinds of covenantal ceremonies or covenantal practices, which are normative in a sense, right? Which are widespread, which are seen as like the thing you do. And actually, we can link in the show notes the episode of Responsa Radio that discusses baby naming ceremonies for girls raises this question about how, on the one hand, it's really cool that there's a lot of creativity about different kinds of ceremonies. But on the other hand, there's something really nice about having some kind of ceremony that is similar in a lot of different cases.
Yeah. I love, though, how Bryn comes in at this point in the conversation and kind of brings it back to the original, oh, well, maybe this could be a substitute for that, right? Which
yeah.
I think this...
Well, and one thing I'm really curious about is if more people will propose this of hatafat brit as a substitute for circumcision, right? And so one thing that I'm really wondering about is something that Max brought up, of observing that some people seem more bothered by hatafat brit than by circumcision, even though circumcision causes a body modification and hatafat brit doesn't. And so, it's hard to know how common this attitude is.
That brings us back to our conversation with Elizabeth Reese about the medicalization of circumcision. And I think that conversation, there's so much there in terms of aha moments of oh my gosh, this explains so much. It explains so much. And I think also another thing that comes out of the thinking about the medicalization of circumcision, and this connects to something that Rabbi Oren Steinitz said also, and something that Max Buckler said, is this question of states and acts. Right. So Max Buckler likes to talk about states and acts. In the Jewish tradition, in halakha, as Rabbi Steinitz reminded us, this is an unresolved question. The question of whether the mitzvah is about being in the state of circumcised or doing the act of circumcision is a dispute among halachic sources that goes back to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I think is really interesting here, and then you should totally continue, is that I think with some of the views that are more pro-circumcision that we talked about with Brian Earp, and I'm thinking in particular of the Benatar's view and Mazur's view, these really kind of erase any kind of distinction between state and act, right? So I think that some, and Brian in his work really goes in this direction in terms of, stressing that health benefits don't matter and kind of thinking about the ethical dimensions of the cutting itself is what we need to do. Some previous discussion of circumcision and genital cutting and bioethics has really not been attuned to this distinction between state and act. And, Brian and others are trying to bring it back, and Max is as well. And so I think that's something that we should really carry forward from this season as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And the piece I want to add here is that the medicalization of circumcision falls very strongly on the state side.
Totally. Yeah.
In the way that it plays out in Jewish practice. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is once it became an option and once it became a normative medical practice in the United States, Jewish parents were now allowed to think about circumcision and were actually, I would argue, being structurally, sociologically pushed into thinking about circumcision as a state rather than an act. And the rabbis at the time, as we discussed with Elizabeth Reese, were very nervous about this because for them, the act is at least as important. Again, it is a long-standing dispute in the Jewish tradition, which one is more important, but they felt that the act was getting short shrift, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And one of my lingering questions from this season is picking up with the history of Jewish responses to the medicalization of circumcision after the chapter that Lizzie was really helping to unfold for us, right? So with her, we were talking about a sort of moment in the late 50s and early 60s and responses from some members of the New York Board of Rabbis to what was happening then. And, we talked about some of the context before and after, but, I think where things went from there and how we got to the sorts of ways that a lot of Jews treat circumcision as so thoroughly medicalized, this is a story that I just really haven't seen much discussion of, right? One big chapter in that story is the decisions by the conservative and reform movements to only train doctors or medical practitioners as mohalim. And so that really added to the medicalization. But beyond that, I do take it that this process was gradual and surely had a lot of really interesting other chapters. And, and I think we see a little bit of that anxiety today in, for example, reform leaders in their sort of circumcision arm talking about the brit milah as a great opportunity for reform mohalim to reach out to families who might otherwise be unaffiliated, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting also to think, and you brought this up in the episode with Elizabeth Reese, but to really think about how the reform movement and to some extent the conservative movement, but really the reform movement with their brit milah program, like really leaned heavy into them. They were like, okay, it's medical.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it that way. In my film, Donnie Aaron, who was the head of the brit milah program at the time, she was all in on like, let me tell you about the health benefits. But now that I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the medicalization of circumcision in the United States, in a way, they were just riding the wave, right? And there are two ways you can go. You could go the way that is upset about the fact that it's being medicalized and all this emphasis is being put on the state as opposed to the act. Or you could really lean hard into the medicalization, and the reform movement made their choice on that one, right?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot that we could say about, not only the reform movement, but some other liberal movements as well of, allowing some kinds of Jewish concepts, of distinctively Jewish ways of thinking and acting to have less of their kind of Jewish content in the minds of people who are doing them than they once did. This is slippery territory, and this is not to criticize anyone or any movement in particular. But what I really hope, and this is something that I'm taking away from this season and from a lot of our work on the podcast and on circumcision texts in the Jewish tradition, is that, a lot of us can really try to find the religious meaning and value in a lot of these practices and think about what they mean to us, and then, really use that to influence a lot of our decisions. I mean, I know you weren't enamored, let's say, of Rabbi Ethan Tucker's position that we talked about in season one of this kind of wrestling with. Did you make that clear? Yeah, of this kind of wrestling.
Was I clear about that?
I think you were. Of this kind of like wrestling with, traditional practices and perspectives from our own sort of ethical standpoint. But I think if one were to take that sort of methodology really seriously, then it would lead one to have different sorts of perspectives, not only on circumcision, but on a lot of topics, even if it wouldn't maybe go as far as you or I might want to go on certain kinds of issues like circumcision.
Yeah, I also want to talk about something that stood out to me from our episode with Jonathan Allen that I've been thinking about ever since that conversation, and that's the identity piece of this. We tried to punch this up on the episode because it's in his wonderful book Uncut, but we talked about how people describe themselves as circumcised or uncircumcised men, right? I'm a cut man. I'm an uncut man. And how that linguistic turn of phrase is a window into how this is really an identity issue. And the thing that I'm sort of reflecting on about that as it relates to the work that we do at Bruchim is a bit of a paradox. And the paradox is that as circumcision was medicalized in the United States, its significance as an identity marker of Jews goes away. If everyone's circumcised, then being a circumcised man, it's not like back in the time of the Hellenists in Palestine, right? It's not back in the time of Alexandria in Egypt and Philo when the bodies were divided that way, where a Jewish body is a circumcised body and an intact body is a Greek body. No. In 2025 in the United States, being circumcised isn't actually any longer an identity marker of being Jewish. Now, there are Jews who may look at their circumcision that way, but as an objective sort of physical anthropological matter, it's just not the case. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and this is something that I think we've come to before. We already mentioned earlier our episode with Naama Carlin, where this sort of issue came up as well. And so, this gets back to the point I was raising just a bit ago about the religious significance of circumcision, that it takes real work to imbue circumcision with religious significance. And, a lot of people don't want to talk about circumcision. That's something that Bruchim runs up against in so many different ways. But, one thing that I would certainly like to see, and that a lot of our efforts are aimed at, is more public discussion of circumcision in lots of ways. Even if that is in support. One thing that I raised in my recorded text study on circumcision and egalitarianism is that although there have been some feminist attempts to reclaim nida, practices around menstruation, as, separable from the sexist context in which they originated, there haven't yet been efforts to do that with circumcision, right? So I don't really know of anyone who's tried to defend circumcision while fully engaging with the sexist context in which it originated. And I want to see that. I want to see people trying to do that, right? And, we can have conversations and we can gain more understanding. But if you think that circumcision is a good thing for Jews and you oppose sexism, this is something that's important to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, someone out there should write a counter tshuva to Bryn's tshuva, right?
That sounds great. That's great. And also come on our podcast and talk about it, even if you're not fully done, right? We love to talk with you about these issues.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Max, this has been a pleasure. This season was really surprising to me and got me thinking in ways that I hadn't thought about this before. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, so that's saying something.
Indeed. This was, such a pleasure to have a lot of these conversations and to listen back to them. And I know that a lot of the issues that we discussed here will be something that will give folks things to think about for so many years to come.
And to quote our first guest, Brian Earp, I do believe we are just scratching the surface. Thank you for listening to the Bruchim Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please go on over to our website, bruchim.online. That's BRUCHIM.online, and consider supporting our organization. We're a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to email us at info@bruchim.online. Lehitraot.